Um, I guess I'll start I'll just kind of talk about the book for a second. So it's a book about a gay teen in kind of rural Virginia who has never really been exposed to anything gay or LGBTQ at all, and is kind of growing up in a very conservative household. He doesn't really have the vocabulary to talk about really anything. He kind of speaks in really kind of short, clipped sentences where it's hard for him to get anything out. And he definitely doesn't have the vocabulary to talk about kind of what he's feeling or what he's experiencing. And really kind of the book is centered around that, just kind of that characterization of him, and then everything that kind of happens related to that and around it, and kind of what it takes for him to learn to speak for himself. It's just off the bat, because this is like one of the most common questions I get. It's not autobiographical. I actually had great parents. I came out when I was 18. They were cool with it. They thought my brother might have been gay, but not me. And I was like, haha, tricked you. And they were cool, but I did, like, if you are gay, you eventually kind of like meet a lot of people who had very, very different experiences, especially, depending where you grow up. So I grew up in Houston, kind of outside of Houston. Lived in Texas until I was 25. And so I met a wide variety of other gay people with other gay experiences, and kind of saw a lot of it firsthand, a lot of it secondhand, that kind of thing. So a lot of that went into this book. My high school, just to kind of give you just kind of a background of what it was like for me in the 90s, it was kind of this weird thing where, like Mike, I didn't really have any exposure to anything related to gay or anything. There wasn't, any kind of known gay population in my high school. But because, when you're never exposed to it, you just kind of assume, or it's easy to assume that you're kind of maybe the only one. And so I knew of 2 out gay kids when I was a senior in high school. And I honestly thought we were maybe the only 3. This was like a high school of 3,600 people, so obviously I was like wrong. And then, of course, once I started reconnecting with kids from high school, like in college or after college, like as all of us started kind of coming out after high school, a lot of my friends that I knew in high school, it turned out that they were closeted as well. It is, I think, a lot different now in general in high schools. But you still see a lot of, there are still a lot of high schools that I think are kind of like stuck in the 90s or earlier throughout the country. It's not necessarily even by state, it's kind of just by local community. Sometimes it's even just by family. There might be a really kind of like with it high school where, some of the kids are just because of, by virtue of their families, are totally not out. And won't be for some time. So that's kind of like just kind of a background of myself, and then also how it sort of related to the book. I did want to talk a bit about kind of like what got me into writing, and how this got published and that sort of thing. So I kind of started writing just because I liked it when I was like I think the earliest I can remember is like maybe 3rd grade. It was like really crappy short stories that I thought were really good at the time. I think there was one about like a robot that stops a war by giving someone $1,000. There's this guy, I read a lot of science fiction when I was like in middle school. And so I started like writing a lot of like sci-fi stories. So there's this one story about a guy who doesn't like his wife, and so he builds a time machine to go back in time to when he was a kid, so he didn't have to live with his wife anymore. This is totally misogynistic now, I realize, but I mean, I was like 11. But his wife kind of like, he just kind of tells her, point blank, like, yeah, I'm leaving you. So in the middle of the night, she kind of like fiddles with his machine, and it ends up sending him to Pluto or Neptune, and he dies on the surface of Neptune. So I mean, like, my writing has evolved a little bit since I was a kid. I hope it's gotten better, but it's kind of always been there where it was really just driven by a desire, and I got more and more into it. And I always wanted to write a book, and I finally did when I was, I think I started when I was 19, and I finished a manuscript when I was 27, 25, 26. It wasn't this book, it was a different one. And the reason it took so long is just because I was really lazy. And this has kind of been a common theme for myself. This first manuscript that I wrote, it was like a kind of like a thriller. It wasn't very good. I kind of looked at it maybe a year ago again just to see what I thought of it. Because I was thinking, oh well, now that I have this one published, maybe I can, go back and get this first book published. But no, it's really kind of like unsalvageable, I think. But I did kind of the same thing with this one, where I started it in 2009, and by the time it actually got, with an agent and sold, it was 2014, 2015. But really, like, if any of you are interested in writing, that was all me. That wasn't really the outside process. Like, there were just periods where I would, I'd write for a little bit, and then I'd put it aside for a year and a half, just because it's hard to kind of like make yourself do that, especially when you don't really have a known audience. So when it's your first book, there's no one trying to tell you to write. There's no deadlines. You don't have an editor or an agent or anything. It's just you, and it's really, really easy to just kind of like put it aside and not think about it for a year and a half. So with this one, I think I wrote it for a few months. I stopped for a year. I wrote it for another few months. And then I got to a point where I was like, okay, I think I can actually try to get it published. So the first step when you're a debut, when you have never been published before, you have to get a literary agent for almost anything. There are some publishers that accept authors that are not agented, but for the most part, really the first step after you write a manuscript is to get a literary agent. And to do that, you have to, it's what's called querying them. You send them a query letter, which is sort of just like a one-page summary of what the book is and who you are and why you think it should be published. It's like a pitch, you're trying to sell it, which is exactly what you're actually doing. And then depending on the agent, that might be the only thing you send at first. You might send them the first 5 pages, the first couple chapters, or whatever. It kind of is different from agent to agent. And then if they like what they see, they'll then kind of come back to you and say, hey, I like this so far, can you send me? And then it's kind of up to them again. Sometimes they just ask for the first 50 pages at that point, or the whole thing. And then if they like what they see, then they will eventually ask for the whole manuscript. And then if they still like what they see, they'll call you and ask to be your agent. And then once you have an agent, you still have to get it published at a publisher. So then the agent, it works with you to kind of like revise everything, make sure it's in the best shape possible. It'll probably go through a couple revisions at least. And then the agent starts what's called the submission process, where they take your manuscript. They have some editors in mind at different publishing houses that they think might be interested in this book. And they'll just send them out, maybe 6, maybe a dozen different editors at different publishers, and see if any of them bite. And if they don't, then they might come back to you with another revision, and if they do, then it's sold, and then it might be another 2 years before it's published. So like the actual process from when you get an agent or when you start, when you're ready to get, when it's no longer really in your hands, that part can take some time. But most of the, like, for me, it was really really fast going from getting an agent to getting it sold to a publisher. It was like a month. But then once you have a publisher, no matter what, it's going to take a while before it's actually published. And that's just because it's, so I also separately, in my day job, work for a different publisher. So I kind of see it from, that side of it. And there's a lot that needs to be done for every book, from, more revisions to kind of like speccing it out to seeing how much it needs to weigh, how many pages it has to be, how big it has to be, how, like, the cover design, how it's going to be marketed and all that stuff. So, and also sometimes just when they want it to be published, because there are some, like, strategic times of year to sell books too. So no matter what, it does take a good amount of time to actually get it, to actually see it in print. But for the most part, like, the longest, by far, like, the longest process, the longest part of the whole, like, from idea to being in print, was all on me and just, waiting around and being a little lazy. I haven't totally gotten out of that. I'm writing a second book. It's in the revision process, which is hard. But a lot of what took so long in this case was also me just kind of like, if I had writer's block or trying to, like, think around something or putting it aside for a couple weeks because I needed a break. So yeah. I don't know, I mean, I kind of ran through my little, like, points a lot more rapidly than I thought I might. I don't know if any of you have any questions about literally anything. The book itself, writing process, getting published, the cover, my sweater, anything. Yeah.
So you see in the beginning, at the end, was that foreshadowing when you said, this is what I see when I want to remember the good parts, this is what I see when I think of him, and I let myself think of him. Is that foreshadowing?
Yeah, it's kind of like that when that part takes place. When he's talking about, like, oh, when I let myself think of him, it's he's writing that from a point kind of in the future, not at the end of the book, but kind of more, not quite at the end of the book, but maybe 2/3 of the way through. Yeah, it's just kind of a way to say, like, oh, well, something goes wrong. Yeah. Yes?
How did you come up with the plot, like,
The plot, so, oh yeah. In general, a book can be either very character-based or very plot-based. So you might, like, think of a plot first and then figure out who needs to be in the book, or you might think of a character and then kind of, like, work from him and see, like, just basically put him or her in a situation and see, well, how would they maneuver around everything. And
was this character?
yeah, so this one was very character. It was, and which is I wasn't ever expecting, because I just thought I would. This was kind of before I knew as much. I mean, not that I'm like some amazing writing guru, but I mean, like, but before I knew as much as I do about writing, I was always kind of naively thinking, like, oh, well, you think of a plot and then you kind of, like, pick people to be in it. But this one I really just imagined, like, Mike, and I kind of, like, built Mike in my mind, and all I knew was that, yeah, he was gay, but he kind of doesn't really understand it, or what that even, like, what that means, like, what the words are for it. He has a hard time communicating, like, that was a really important thing. And then everything that happened kind of came from that. So it was just like, well, okay. I mean, like, really what I ultimately wanted to do is, imagine someone who has a hard enough time speaking about kind of everyday ordinary things, and then give him something that even very eloquent people have a hard time kind of expressing themselves about. And how does he, what does he do with that? How does he kind of like, it's kind of like a fight or flight kind of thing, or swim or drown, whatever, like where you have to kind of figure it out or else. So I just kind of so that's why I kept, there's all this stuff that's thrown at him, really because I wanted to get him to a point where he could, speak for himself. Yes?
Do you like the cover of the book?
Do I like it? Yeah, so I didn't realize this until later, but I really like, just putting aside the book, like just visually, I like textured horizontal stripes. And I started realizing that after I bought my third sweater that was kind of like, because I'd wear something like this, or I have two others, and people would be like, oh, it's like your book cover. And I'm like, yeah, that wasn't on purpose, though. I just really like how, I actually want a sweater of the book cover. Like without even the words, I care about the stripes. So what that is supposed to be is, it's like a kind of like a graphic representation of the sunrise that's described on the first couple pages. Because
When they described that, I was like,
yeah. It kind of goes in the same order and everything. And it's because the graphic designer, who's really amazing. Oh, so just so you know, graphic designers they kind of usually work either freelance or with the publisher. And especially when you're a debut author, they're not like, hey, is this, what do you think of this cover design? Or what do you want the cover design? They're really just, it's more like, here it is, hope you like it, because, they're kind of calling the shots. But I really lucked out, because I love this design a lot. And I love that it's kind of like, it has some meaning to it. It's not just, polka dots or whatever. Yeah.
What does it mean when you're a freelance writer?
Okay, so the freelance, when I was talking about freelance, I was talking about the cover designers. It just means that they kind of they work for themselves, and different publishers might hire them out. So they don't, sometimes if you're freelance, you're not working at a company, you're kind of working for yourself, and companies will hire you for specific jobs or process. So you can be a freelance writer. I have some friends who are freelance writers in the sense that they might be hired by different publications or newspapers or magazines or whatever to write articles, or they might just sell specific stories or whatever, as opposed to being a staff writer, which is someone who works at the New York Times and always writes stuff for the New York Times. Yeah.
So if a very famous author, for example, Jeff Kennedy. So if he wants to write a book, it'll be so quick to publishing because he's so famous.
So for someone, for an established author, a really big name author, it's this weird thing where when you start out, the publisher has way more leverage than you do, because you're just you're whoever, But then there's eventually, if you keep getting more and more successful, there's a turning point where suddenly you have a lot more leverage than the publisher. So Stephen King or J.K. Rowling or David Baldacci or John Grisham or whoever, all of these people, they can basically do whatever they want. They can say I want to write a book about this, and any publisher will want to take it because they know that just the name will sell. Because publishing ultimately is a business. So they kind of have to work that way. So yes, as an example, I sold. So this first book was, I had to write the entire manuscript and then get an agent and then sell that to a publisher. With my second book, my editor had kind of already made a decision, on her own. This was her kind of style. She's and she told me this early on. She's I like to sign on authors rather than individual books, meaning I would like to work with you. I don't want to just sign, do this book and then that's it. I really do want to see what else you're going to write, and if it's a fit, publish that as well. So for the second book, I wrote 3 chapters and then kind of like an outline. And she had some feedback, and then I kind of revised it a bit, and then sold it based on that. So she agreed to publish it before she read the whole thing, which was not something that all publishers will do with a second book. Some will, she decided to, which is great for me. But that also made it harder because then I had a deadline to write a first draft, and I was like hurrying through it, and I turned it in, and it was like not great. So now I have a lot more work, on this end, like with the revisions, whereas with this one, it was kind of a lot more polished by the time it ever got to the editor. Second books, I learned too late are harder than first books, and that's been corroborated by a lot of different authors that I've talked to, who when I said oh, I was hoping the second book would be easier, they just kind of laughed at me. So, yeah. Yes?
When I read this part of the book, I realized I could make a connection with a short film we saw.
Oh yeah?
Yeah.
Which one?
It was part of a series called Young Queer and Woke, and one of them is called Gabber Lover.
Sorry, the series was called what?
Young Queer and Woke.
Young Queer and Woke?
Yeah, it was part of New Fest, the LGBT film festival.
Oh, okay. I'm gonna, hold on, I'm not just checking my text, I wanna actually write that down. Oh God. Young Queer and Woke. Young. And it was part of what festival?
Part New Fest.
New Fest?
It's a series of short films that relate to LGBT and that stuff. And one of the short films that was in that series was called Gabber Lover. It was about 2 girls who was riding on a motorcycle through France. And one of the girls started as they were doing that, one of the girls developed feelings for the other girl.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's like a simple motor ride turned into something more deep.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, because the book says that Mike and Sean were hey, and then they were basketball games, walking
Yeah.
on the beach.
So it kind of develops kind of gradually like that. What it's called? Grab Your Lover?
Gabber Lover.
Yeah, Gabriel. It was French.
Oh.
It was a French, right?
Okay. So you're from the graphic arts campus. So what, can you kind of, I know I'm randomly asking you guys now. Can you tell me what you what that is, what you do? Is because I read up a little bit, but it specializes in graphic arts and journalism and other stuff?
Well, actually, so the building that we're in is the Graphic Arts Communication Campus, and it used to be one big high school.
Okay.
And now it's split up into a bunch of different high schools. So we are actually just from one of the schools, which is called Stephen Mather High School,
Okay.
which has a more specific focus, which one of the students I'm sure could talk about.
Landscape.
That's what?
Landscape.
Oh, landscape. Okay, nice.
And other stuff too.
You say core values? Okay.
Somebody talk about our CTE mission.
And there's some CTE classes involving architecture, finishing,
Okay.
landscaping, all that stuff.
Carpentry.
Craftsmanship, yeah.
Oh, wow.
What's the organization that we partner with?
The National Park Service.
Oh, okay. Yay. Yes.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you that because the library that serves the 3 high schools there is still called the Graphic Arts Campus Library, that's probably
Yeah.
they
Okay.
forwarded to you. Yeah.
Okay. That makes sense now. Yeah, my high school is just like a regular boring high school. I mean, it's just a giant suburban thing where it was just. What's that?
I said that's cool.
It was all right. It was just kind of it was one of those things where because it's all I knew, I didn't really have anything to compare it to. So then I went to school at the University of Texas in Austin, which is for Texas very liberal and kind of open, and that's what made me when I went there. That was the first time I kind of realized that my suburb was actually pretty conservative and weird. And then I moved to New York, which then made me realize, well, actually Austin is liberal, but it's not New York liberal. Yeah.
Are there other covers in the book, or is this one?
There's a paperback that's coming out, and so they changed the paperback cover to be, it's two guys who are, their faces are really close and they're about to kiss, but it's just like the silhouette of them, and the silhouette is made up of these same stripes, but then the background is kind of white, because I think they wanted to change it a little bit, but not too much. So I kind of became friends with the graphic designer, and he was telling me, he was like, I don't want to change it. I'm like, I don't want to change the cover. Can you tell your editor that you like it the way it is? And I was like, it won't have any effect because I'm just a first-time author or whatever. He did tell me that I've never seen it before, but what they do when they create covers, and this is true of where I work, which is Scholastic as well, they kind of make a couple different versions of the covers, but if they have one idea that they really like and they kind of don't think that another choice is really needed, they'll make the second option like clearly worse, so that everyone will choose the one that they want. So I think that's what he did in this case, because like the other one, I think it was supposed to be more of like a painting of the sunrise, but he thought that might look a little cheesy or something. So I never saw it, so I don't know. But I do remember thinking, I was like, I kind of want the cover to have something about the sunrise, but I don't want a drawing of a sunrise because that looks a little too, on the nose, I guess. So that's why this was kind of perfect to me. And it stands out, which is, it's good for
How do you, so there's like a millions of authors. How do you come up with something new or try to compete with them sort of?
Yeah. I mean, so this story, it's not like this is the first book ever that's involved a gay kid who has a hard time coming out or being, that is a well-worn story. It's just, I think what made it kind of different was really the character himself and how that kind of came through in how he speaks. It was really this entire book was really so much about just communication for me. So it can be the character, it can be the characters, it can be a different kind of twist on a plot. I don't know. It's not. I wouldn't waste so much time or energy worrying about coming up with a story or a plot that's radically different from anything that has ever been written. I mean, it is always great to do that, and it's fun to do that. But it can be a story that's like a new take on an existing kind of story. It can be something totally different. But as long as it has something, as long as there's it's your own kind of story. It's not like a rehash. Then I think it works.
How do you organize all your ideas? Because the other author that we met, she had this wall, and she would cover this with paper, and she would visually see her ideas
So
understand it, comprehend it.
do you mean ideas for novels?
Yeah. How do you
I have a note on my phone called Novel Ideas, and it's I can read some of it to you. It's but some of it is just I think of it on the spot and I write it down just in case, and then I'll read it later after never having thought about it since, and then I'll be like, oh, that's a dumb idea. So some of these I'm reading for the first time. Guy who can read exactly what personality traits someone likes and immediately adjusts his interactions to accommodate. So a bartender seems cold and he understands immediately she likes super laid back people, so he becomes super laid. I don't know why I wrote that down. Now that I'm reading out loud, it sounds a little strange. Everyone living in a dream state, I don't know what that means. Guy who gets, I actually kind of like this one. Guy who gets superpowers in his 70s after living a life wanting to be more than he was, but now he's in his 70s, so he's like, well, what am I going to do with that? I don't know how I would build a whole story around that. Some of these ideas are just kind of like interesting on their own, but I don't know. This is long. Okay, hold on. Not that one. Oh, okay. A guy who donated his entire life savings to an end of the world group. So this is actually based on something that really happened. Novel starts right before or after predicted end of the world. Novel focuses on the aftermath and his coming to terms. So there's a guy who donated his entire life savings to this like crazy cult guy who was predicting the end of the world in, I think, May 2011. And then, we're still here. So afterwards, I was just kind of imagining, well, what did he do? Like after, because he was so certain that the world was going to end that he donated he's now didn't have any money left after that. So yeah, so I was just kind of curious about. Well, I think it would be, because I tend to, like. Yeah, I know. It can go in a lot of different directions. It can go into like a revenge kind of like thriller direction, or it can go into kind of like a more introspective, like character-driven one where he's like, what do I do now? Yeah. Did you have a?
Like, you told us that because we were very confused about the cover. Abby said the cover's like the sunset. So when you say that the title, it looks like this, you're actually referring to the first page.
That's how it first. That's how it's first used. It kind of takes on multiple meanings after that, because it's kind of like, what does it look like to have to, like, what does it look like when you put someone in a situation where they're kind of like forced to rock the boat when they really, really, it goes against their entire nature to, or, what does it look like to have kind of unconditional love of your own kids, that kind of thing. At the very end of my acknowledgments, which is not actually part of the story, I thanked my parents and also my husband's parents for being so great, and tried to tie it together with the title of the book that way by saying, a lot of gay kids have to wonder what unconditional love looks like, but we never did. It looks like this. That said, like the actual idea for the title was totally accidental. If you've ever, started writing something in Microsoft Word and then save it for the first time, it'll suggest a file name based on the first few words. And that's exactly what happened in this case, because those are the first 4 words of the book. So, and I wrote it. Those were the first 4 words that I wrote too. So I wrote a couple pages, hit save, and it suggested it looks like this doc. And I was like, that's fine for now. It'll be a working title, because I kind of like the sound of it also. And it just kind of somehow made it through the whole process and ended up on the cover. It was really just because my editor really liked it, so it kind of like stuck, and it made sense. Yes?
Like the story you said about when you started writing, I can kind of relate to that.
About which part?
The fact that you wrote sci-fi stories in the past.
Yeah.
I kind of read that kind too.
Do you have a like certain sci-fi authors that you like to read? Oh, okay. I
mostly seen like movies and stuff.
Yeah, well that kind of has a big influence too. So I happen to be like reading in middle school a lot of Ray Bradbury, and so like everything I wrote for like this 2 or 3 year period were these sort of like kind of quick. It's basically like this thing where I had a quick idea and I was like, oh, that could be something, and then I just wrote a story around it, which is why. I mean, I think for that Neptune one, I was just like, oh, I want someone to be really mean to his wife and then get his comeuppance when she, messes with his time machine. So yeah, it was kind of like that. But I don't remember why I fell out of sci-fi. I kind of have a weird relationship with sci-fi where I like the idea of it a lot, but I'm kind of always on the edges of it, looking in, I guess.
Honestly, I mostly, for my stories, I usually combine two genres.
Really? I love that. I have a weird thing for like multi-genre stories. Did you ever see Vanilla Sky? Okay, it's a yeah. It's a Tom Cruise movie that it starts. I love stories that that start out where you think it's one story and then abruptly shift to a different genre altogether. And so that one kind of did that, where it seems like a kind of a
Oh my gosh.
interpersonal sort of drama, and then just bam becomes sci-fi.
Sorry.
Okay.
It's just in the book when he ends up going to this place. It's like a camp where
Yeah.
he's supposed to coach him to not be gay anymore, to not have these thoughts. Did you how did you learn about what that was? Did you talk to people who had that experience? Did you do research?
It was research that was a lot of firsthand accounts, and the weird and fortunate thing about these conversion therapy camps or reparation camps or pray the gay away camps or whatever is that they have been on the they've been on the decline, and it's been a very, very sudden thing. So when I started writing this, they were still kind of in a lot of places. By the time it got published, I was trying to find examples of specifically ones where it's like a camp where you actually stay there, like you sleep, a boarding camp where you sleep over. And I think as of 2 years ago, there were only 3 left in the U.S. Most of the ones are just kind of you go for it's like a day trip, I guess. I don't know. But yeah, so I was reading a lot of accounts, and in earlier drafts, this camp was a lot crazier, and I toned it down in kind of revision. It was insane. But now it just kind of it eventually got to a place where it was just he needed a reason to kind of want to snap him awake and be I need to get out of here, and that was just kind of feeling suddenly creeped out and that he kind of opens his eyes to what is going on around him. But before it was a lot more dramatic, and I toned it down because I don't it seemed like a distraction at that point, because there was a gay conversion camp can be its own novel, and it wasn't supposed to be about that anyway. It was just one little kind of small piece of it. But another is that this touch therapy or holding therapy that he talks about is a lot more modern than some of the other stuff that they used to do, shock therapy or aversion therapy or anything that involves pain or discomfort. That stuff kind of all, thankfully, or for the most part, has died down. There's probably still some happening kind of underground, but yeah. So that was to answer your question. Yeah, that was just based on a lot of firsthand accounts that I would find online, read about. My friend and my husband. My friend founded this nonprofit called I'm From Driftwood, and my husband works for it, and it kind of just collects first-person stories. So it's someone just kind of LGBTQ stories. So someone just telling some first-person account of something to the camera, and there were a couple that were about aversion therapy. So those made it into. Yes.
I wanted to know who's Catherine and Bill.
Oh, Catherine and Bill are my husband's parents. My husband Damien, and yeah, my in-laws, who I love very much. They're great. Yes.
Usually when I read, I always like to put myself in the first person perspective.
Yeah. How does that work when it's Like, what do you do when the personality of that character is like very different from yours? Do you kind of like imagine having that personality?
Yeah.
Okay.
It would be pretty hard because like you go, it's like a different person. Like
Yeah.
yeah, it'd be hard because they have like a different personality.
Yeah. I tend to imagine people that I know in the roles of characters that I read. Or I did a lot, especially when I was younger. I don't think I do that as much anymore. But it's not like a conscious thing. I just suddenly realized that I'm like, oh wait, I'm thinking of Steven right now.
It's more like a movie than you being in the first character.
Yeah.
It would be the audience.
Yeah. Exactly. Yes.
Like, did you want to do all since you were a kid?
Yeah. The earliest that I can remember wanting that is, I think, 3rd grade. When I wrote that Robot Stops a War short story.
If you had to think of another job, what would it be?
Another job besides being an author? Wow. I don't know. I was a reporter for a couple years, but for like a small town. It was fun, but it was also kind of at the same time. It was fun. I think there were a lot of things I liked about it, but I'm not a very kind of like confrontational person at all. And you have to, and that was the one thing I really didn't like. Like, I didn't like going up to people who I knew didn't want to talk to me. It's actually really hard, and they actually tell you this in journalism school. It's really hard to write obituaries or to report for obituaries because you have to talk to people whose loved one just died, and that is you get a wide range of reactions. Sometimes people are just really, it's like cathartic for them and they want to talk to you. Sometimes people just do it because they want to honor that person, but they are uncomfortable. And sometimes people will, slam the door in your face or whatever. And just like, so, I mean, that's an extreme example of it, but like knowing that with like pretty much every encounter, it was always like I hated kind of going into an interview. But I love asking questions. So once it kind of like started, I was fine. And writing I like, so. I didn't answer your question at all. I don't know what a second job would be. I really have no idea. If it turns out that I hate being an author, I don't know what I'll do. That sounds really bleak, but it's not meant that way. Yes.
Okay, so if you were to put this into like a TV series, would it be like animated or like
Live
I don't
action?
know, or like live
I think live action.
Really?
Yeah, I know. I think live action, but like with a certain kind of style that I can picture in my head, but it's hard for me to describe. Like a really kind of like, how some movies, I'm talking movies, but how some movies you watch and it's like, you can tell they're supposed to be serious movies just based on like the production quality, like how crisp everything looks or whatever. Yeah, and then some you look and you can tell that it's supposed to be
Like a kid's movie.
yeah, I mean, even aside from like what's happening, but it's like like they actually use different cameras, and so it looks different even though it's hard to tell. It sounds weird, I know, but I like that like kind of really crisp, like kind of solid look. So that's what I'm kind of imagining. If it was like well, I don't know. Do you guys watch Walking Dead?
Yes. Oh my God.
Okay. So there are some really beautiful like shots. I mean, putting aside, they're eating people's insides and everything. Like some of the shots are like really gorgeous. So like, and like when they're, especially in the openings, when they're doing like panning or whatever, like basically any non-action scene is beautifully shot. That's what I want. That's what I want in my series. I don't want any, zombies. I just want the beautiful cinematography.
It could be like the doll, kind of just like the doll side, but it's like more beautiful. Like
The-
Walking Dead is more like when they were doing like landscape pictures, it would usually be dolls.
Oh, dull. Yeah. Yes. Yeah, like that. There's that Instagram filter. It's kind of like that. But yeah. Yes.
your day job or the way you look at the job?
A little, in lots of different ways. So it's, like, so the thing about this especially is that your activity as an author you'll be doing nothing, and then there'll just be this flurry of activity, and then it goes back to nothing and waiting for a bit, and then another flurry, And so because I have a full-time job separately from this, there'll be like a month where I'm feeling exhausted and overworked because I'm doing 2 jobs. And then the next month I'll be bored at work because it'll happen to be slow at work, and then I won't have any author stuff to do either. Separately, because I work for a different publisher, I I've heard a lot of stories from people at Scholastic, about, well, I shouldn't say anything. I've heard a lot of stories from people about like kind of annoying authors, and so that made me, I'm already kind of like an anxious kind of person, so that made me worried about like I don't want to be that annoying author. But I think that made me a little too deferential in certain areas where I would, my editor is really, really good about saying like, look, this is your book. Ultimately, everything is your decision. With regards to the story. But I still kind of want to cede a lot of ground, which maybe isn't the worst thing. She's been doing this since the 70s. And she knows her stuff, and when you're an author, it's sometimes better to just kind of like think like, okay, your editor probably knows what she's talking about, and you might be too close to this to look at it in an objective way. So yeah, I think working for a publisher has kind of made me think a lot of the other side of the relationship in both good and bad ways. Yes?
A question related to Francis. I assume, were you a journalism major?
Yes.
And do you have any advice for any of our students who may be thinking about becoming writers?
Writers in general or journalism? Journalism? Oh, God. And this is a very kind of like big picture thing. The state of journalism and the way like facts are now kind of more contested than they used to be is going to be, I think, a huge challenge. And so in the past especially, journalists are taught to look at everything objectively and kind of like weigh both sides equally. And there are some outlets that kind of do that a little too, in my opinion, to the letter, where they'll be like, okay, there's one side of this argument and another side of this argument, so we're going to give them equal airtime. And I think CNN did this especially, and they've learned, I think, since then. But sometimes those two perspectives aren't actually equal perspectives, because when you have someone who's saying, white nationalism is great, and someone who's saying, no, racism is bad, like those aren't really equivalent ideas. And so you don't necessarily give someone the same platform. If someone is saying like the earth is round versus the earth is flat, you're not saying like, well, these are two different perspectives, so we have to give them equal airtime. Like that's not, because one of them is a factual thing. And I think the more that has been done, like the more that kind of has eroded the understanding of what facts are and whether they can be contested. And I think now there's a large segment of the population that thinks of facts as as arguable.
Negotiable.
Yeah, exactly, as negotiable. They and kind of like the line between fact and opinion has kind of gotten a bit blurred. So I guess that was really more of it's less advice, but more of that's something to really genuinely will have to keep in mind like every day. If you're a reporter, you work in facts. And you have to kind of like make that distinction and make it clear and not kind of like cede that ground. But as far as more practical advice, like getting a job, is that what you mean?
Yeah, like being a writer in general.
Yeah, I have so if you want to if you want to be a writer like like in a creative field where it's kind of more freelance in the sense that like if you want to have a day job like I do, and then but also kind of like just to can support your writing, I have found that it helps to have a day job that isn't creative, because sometimes that can drain your kind of creative energy. So I used to, when I was a reporter and I was writing all day, I would find it a lot harder to go home and then write for myself, because I was using up all of my energy for work. My job at the publisher isn't creative. It's actually kind of data based. So I don't spend any of my creative energy at work, and so I have a lot more left over for writing, and that's worked out really well for me. It does mean you might end up with a job that you're not doing. You maybe don't have a passion for, but you are then reserving your passion for your kind of like your outside, creative stuff. Yes.
Is there anything you like to read sci-fi books?
I'm sorry.
Is there anything sci-fi books?
I kind of, it comes and goes. It's hard to explain. Like, I love the idea of sci-fi. It's really hard for me to find one that I like a science fiction story that I like. But then every now and then one will come along, especially in movies, where I love the way it's told.
Like Harry Potter?
Well, yeah, Harry Potter absolutely did it for me. So that's actually a good example. Like, I'm not a huge... fantasy is kind of the same way, where I love the idea of it, but I don't really get into... Like, I didn't really get into Lord of the Rings or any of that kind of stuff. But I really got into Harry Potter. I really got into this middle grade book called Adventurers Guild that just came out that my friend wrote. Excuse me, two of my friends co-wrote. And I wasn't expecting to, because it was for middle schoolers, and I tend to read. I tend to not really get into middle school level books. But it was for middle school, and it was fantasy, and so I was like, it's a real hit or miss for me, but I loved it. It's just if it's told well and written well, I really like it.
What's it called? I'm writing it down so I can buy it for the library.
Oh.
Adventures
Adventurers
Guild?
Guild.
Adventurers Guild. And who's the author?
It's Zach Lauren Clark. Lauren is Loran. Zach Clark and Nick Eliopoulos. Yeah.
I'll find that.
Yes.
Honestly, when we first got the book, we kind of said it looks like when the TV's broken and you see
Oh, yeah.
kind of colors.
Yeah.
We thought it looked like that.
Yeah. Is that? You mean like an old kind of staticky TV? Yeah. Okay.
Not like static, but when it's
Like-
broken and you see the colors.
Oh, yeah. I see what you mean. Yeah.
Why
Oh,
do
yeah.
you do that?
I don't know. Yes. Have I ever read? Sorry, the God? Ga? Gone. Oh, okay. No. No, sorry. It's just G-O-N? Oh, okay. I'm going to write that one down too. Hold on.
Like, is they're all books have different names, or is it like Gone? The first book is called Gone.
Michael Grant.
Yeah.
You do have those in the library, guys.
Michael who?
Grant.
Grant.
Do you have any advice for LGBT teenagers?
A
There's a lot of issues that come up in the book
yeah.
that people are dealing with.
I mean, it depends where you might be. If you are totally closeted where no one knows, that's it's fine. Like, wait until you are comfortable. But the hardest part is starting and getting to that point where you can trust someone enough to kind of tell them. But once you cross that threshold, it just gets so much easier, because then there's twice as many people in the world who know, and then if you tell 2 more people, then there's 4 times as many, the first people I ever told I was 15 or 16, and they were like my two best friends at the time, and I was 100% certain that they wouldn't have an issue with it, and it was still insanely difficult and nerve-wracking to tell them, but once it was out, it was like, there's no going back, and I love that because it was like, oh, it's so freeing. And then you just tell more and more, and then like once it's out there, like you suddenly realize how much weight you were kind of carrying on your own. If you're already out, there are a number of different kind of reasons for advice, depending on if it's your family. You will also get to a point where you kind of have like a chosen family, and it is also a temporary thing because you will eventually be able to get out. If it's not your family, and that's fine, and it's just more kind of like, well, finding other people. There are a lot of resources online for connecting with other LGBTQ people. I would go through legitimate channels though, because there are also a lot of predatory people out there. But it's kind of hard for me to kind of put myself into that hypothetical, only because my experience was very much like I just kind of waited it out. Aside from telling a couple friends in high school, I waited it out, and then once I got to college, it was just, and that kind of taught me that like, oh, it was so temporary, in the way that any high school problem really is, because you will eventually leave high school, and whatever problems you had in high school are going to seem so trivial and hilarious later on. Like, I can't imagine being worried about what I used to be worried about.
My dad told me that all the time. He's like, when he gets college or that's when you go. Anytime someone problem, he starts laughing.
Yeah. It keeps happening. Like, it's hard to imagine, like, being worried or upset about what I was worried about, 2 months ago. And like, it just kind of, people tend to be emotionally durable, ultimately, which is good.
Unfortunately, that's all the time that we have, but Rafi will be around and he'll sign everyone's books,
Yeah.
so let's thank him for coming.
Thank you.